Good evening. My name is Mary Ann Fitzpatrick, and I have the honor of serving as the Executive Vice President and Provost for the University of South Carolina. I am here this evening in place of President Michael Amaritis, who was able to see some of you earlier this evening, but had a previous engagement. I want to welcome our honored guests, members of the state legislature, their staff, a number of statewide and community leaders, members of our Board of Trustees, my faculty, students, and colleagues for the official opening of the Center for American Civil Leadership and Public Discourse. Why don't we... I have the honor of being the provost, and we have a really an award-winning hospitality, retail, and sports management school. And they talk about soft openings and real openings, grand openings. And as many of you know who followed us over the past year, we've had a number of wonderful presentations. And tonight, I think, will really set us off on a wonderful event. Many of us are deeply concerned in higher education and in the American civil life at how little information Americans have, really, about the Constitution, about the founding of our country, about the roles of the legislature, the Supreme Court, and the presidency, all of the building blocks and basic notions of civic life in America, the real foundations of American democracy. And that, of course, is really one of the key missions of our center, to really bring outstanding leaders, to pull our faculty and staff and students together to really re-energize our sense of civics, really, what is no longer taught in our K-12 schools. And the university is really stepping up to re-energize that. We all, of course, or certainly those of us in the room today, are deeply distressed about the nature of public discourse, about the notion that we can no longer engage with one another unless we have exact agreement on a whole variety of issues. I tend to believe personally in my own life that truth can emerge through interaction and through dealing with one another and through looking at things from very different sides. But social scientists have been telling us for way over 20 years that we are bowling alone, that we are not engaging in our neighborhoods, in our communities. We move to avoid people who have different political or social values. And this is really eroding our entire public life. And that's really what the center is really centrally about. I am proud to say I'm a professor of communication, and I am deeply concerned about the impact of social media and technology on our children. I believe that algorithms are raising our children, and we will live to rue the day when we've created kids. We see this very often even in university classrooms where students are not able to interact with one another. They've lost that ability to communicate and to interact. And this is something I think thoughtful people are deeply concerned about. But we're particularly honored tonight in our inaugural session, our grand opening, as we say, to have as our inaugural speaker, Rabbi Meir Soloveichik. He's speaking with us on America's legacy of religious freedom. Our speaker is one of the leading contemporary voices on faith in America and rabbi of one of the oldest Jewish congregations in the United States, founded in 1654 by 23 Jews of Spanish and Portuguese descent. He received his PhD in religion from Princeton University, and among his many awards and honors, he received the Canterbury Medal for his public defense of religious liberty, an award that recognizes an individual who's demonstrated courage and commitment to defending religious liberty for people of all faiths. Um, there will be a much more sophisticated and detailed introduction of our distinguished speaker. And also, I would like to turn the podium over to our Dean of the McCausland College of Arts and Sciences, who will welcome you on behalf of the McCausland College community. Thank you for coming tonight, and I know we're going to have a very enjoyable and thoughtful evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Provost Fitzpatrick. I have the pleasure of being in between the Provost and tonight's main event, so be jealous. I do want to take a moment, though, to share with you the importance of this moment, not only for the McCausland College, but for the University of South Carolina. So today, as we launch the South Carolina Center for American Civic Leadership and Public Discourse, a center that is grounded in the conviction that a thriving democracy depends not only on strong institutions, but on citizens capable of thoughtful leadership, ethical reasoning, and sustained public dialogue across differences. As Provost Fitzpatrick said, that is no easy task in today's world. It's fitting, though, that this center finds its home in the McCausland College of Arts and Sciences. Our namesake, Peter McCausland, whose generosity and vision give our college its name. Peter's belief in the enduring values of ideas, inquiry, and civic responsibility is woven directly into the center's mission. I'm also proud to acknowledge the endowed professorship supporting the executive director role, a signal of the long-term commitment of intellectual leadership and public impact at events like this evening. The McCausland College is uniquely positioned to steward this work. We're home to extraordinary disciplinary breadth, from history and philosophy to political science, psychology, the arts, and natural sciences. Fields that collectively help us understand who we are, how we govern ourselves, and how we might live well together. And just as important as our breadth is our reach. Our faculty teach nearly every undergraduate student at USC. That scale allows the work of the center to shape civic learning not as an add-on, but as a defining feature of what a Carolina education is. At a time when public discourse often fractures rather than unites, the center stands for something better: rigorous inquiry, principled disagreement, and leadership rooted in evidence, history, and moral reflection. It affirms the idea that civic leadership is not about the volume of our voice or our victory in debate, but about our responsibility, listening, and the courage to engage in complex questions in good faith. We've been blessed to have as interim director Dr. Christopher Tollefson, a professor of philosophy. Chris brings intellectual depth and a deep commitment to public engagement, qualities that have guided the center at its founding moment and helped set a strong course for its future. I'm deeply appreciative to Chris, and I'd like to welcome him up to the microphone.
Friends, thank you all for joining us here this evening for our inaugural launch event of the South Carolina Center for Civic Leadership, American Civic Leadership and Public Discourse. I want to thank both the Provost, Marianne Fitzpatrick, and our Dean, Tommy Hodges, for their warm introductions. And I also want to give special thanks to Dean Hubbard, who has shown exceptional generosity to the center over this past year. This is, I think, the third, maybe the fourth event that we've had. We've had a lot of events here, and I'm really very grateful to you for hosting them. I think it's important also to thank those who helped shepherd the center into existence. Most prominently, the chairman of the board of trustees, Thad Westbrook, President Amaritas, and the former dean of the McCausland College of Arts and Sciences, Joel Samuels. Finally, in the realm of thanks, I really want to offer just a very special thanks to Rabbi Hesh Epstein and Rabbi Meir Mueller of Chabad of South Carolina for hosting a fantastic lunch. I mean, really a great lunch, and I'm told that the chef will eventually have a food truck that will be parking on Green Street outside of the library, and he'll see me there. But I'm very, very grateful for the hospitality that we were shown at lunchtime today. We live in a time of intense disagreement about morality, politics, religion, and many now recognize the urgency of overcoming conflict, of listening to one another, and of engaging in reasoned discourse rather than angry shouting. Our nation faces a common challenge. How can we, as educators, students, and citizens, make progress in restoring our common ties of civic friendship and reciprocity? The Center for Civic Leadership aims to do this by expanding fluency in the core ideals and values that have shaped American history, exploring themes such as ordered liberty, democratic self-governance, rule of law, justice, equality, and unalienable rights. The overarching mission of the center is to promote the dialogical, cultural, and civic literacies that are crucial to a well-ordered and flourishing society, including through our public events. And so before I introduce our speaker, let me mention a couple such events that we have coming up in the spring. On February 19th, the center will co-host with the USC College of Education, the McCausland College of Arts and Sciences, and the Constitutional Law Center here at the law school, a conversation between USC professor of law Derek Black and Frederick Hess of the American Enterprise Institute titled Education Across Our Divides, a Civil Conversation about K-12, Campuses, and Common Ground. And on March 5th, we'll host a conversation with legal scholar Erica Bacchiacchi and my colleagues from philosophy and from women and gender studies, Mary Nickel and Leah McClymans, titled Faith, Family, and Feminism. These are the beginnings of what we're calling the Center's Contested Conversation series, in which we bring thinkers from differing perspectives on important issues to explore both their disagreements and their agreements in an open but civil manner. Before I turn to introducing our speaker, just a quick procedural matter. Towards the end of the talk, or earlier in the talk, you will be given note cards, and towards the end of the talk, those will be collected for questions. Right? If you have a question for the speaker, write them down, and then I will introduce the audience questions to our speaker during the Q&A session. Now tonight, we're honored, very honored, to have as our guest Rabbi Meir Soloveichik. Rabbi Soloveichik, known as Sali to his friends, is rabbi of Congregation Civic, close, excellent, Israel, which I am now the second person, and there will be a third, I promise, to say that this is the oldest Jewish congregation in the United States. He's also the director of the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought at Yeshiva University, and a senior scholar at the Tikva Fund. He graduated summa cum laude from Yeshiva University and received his PhD in religion from Princeton University. Much of his writing and academic work focuses on the American founding and the unique story and role of religion in the United States. His most recent book is Providence and Power, 10 Portraits in Jewish Statesmanship. He serves on both the Presidential Commission on Religious Liberty and the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And I'll just add on a personal note that it was a delight for me to serve with Sali in 2019 and 2020 on a State Department Commission on Unalienable Rights, during which time I learned a tremendous amount of both history and popular culture from Sali. Sali, I don't know if you remember, but you recommended that I watch The Expanse, and I'm a fan. Excellent show. Tonight, he speaks to us on George Washington's Jewish letters and the creation of a constitutional republic. Let's please welcome our speaker, Rabbi Meir Soloveichik.
I want to thank the provost and the dean for their incredibly gracious words. And I join with them in my own aspiration to advance civic education in this country. And so it's such a privilege to be invited to address all of you here today as part of this incredibly important project. And I want to say what a blessing it is to be here with Chris Tolfson. Here in Columbia. We spoke often about me coming to visit, and it's such a delight to spend time with you, Chris, and look forward, please God, to many more opportunities. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I want to thank all of you. Can I say y'all? Is that okay? I asked Chris if that was cultural appropriation, if I said y'all. But he assured me that I could say it. So if it's offensive, cancel Chris instead of me. So I want to thank y'all for the incredible, very warm welcome that I've received here in Columbia. And it's such a joy to be here with all of you, and really looking forward to meeting you and to spending time with you this evening. Everything's coming across clearly? Everybody can hear me? Terrific. In her biography of the great pitcher Sandy Koufax, Jane Levy describes a watershed moment in the cultural memory of American Jewry, which was Koufax's famous refusal to pitch for the Dodgers in the first game of the World Series because it fell out on the sacred Jewish day of Yom Kippur. Coach Walter Alston chose, that's the Dodgers manager, chose Don Drysdale instead, known as Big D, to pitch. But the Dodgers got destroyed. As Levy tells us, the score was 7-1 when Alston came to the mound to relieve Drysdale. And Don Drysdale looks at him and says, "Hey, Skip, bet you wish I was Jewish today, too." Levy writes, "For Jews, the loss was a win. If Big D could joke about being one of the chosen people, that was already something, a tacit acknowledgement of their acceptance into the mainstream. Shtetl, farewell." Now, Drysdale might have been joking, but the truth is that one of the fascinating aspects of the American story is that some of its founders and greatest figures identified deeply with the story of the Jewish people, with the story of biblical Israel, and saw the biblical story as a parallel to that of America. And unlike Don Drysdale, they meant it in all seriousness. And it's only with this in mind can we truly appreciate what it means to speak about American civics, to talk about the ideas behind documents such as the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. The late Chief Rabbi of England, my very much missed friend, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, described how when he was the age of the students here, he visited the United States for the first time, visiting from the UK. And he came to Washington, D.C., and he strolled around, and he visited the memorials. And they struck him, not because he had never seen memorials. If you've been to London, you know, London's filled with memorials. But because he noticed something unique. Unlike British memorials, American memorials featured not only images, but also words, ideas. So he went to the Jefferson Memorial. He saw not only the statue of Jefferson, but he saw Jefferson's words, Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom. He went to the Lincoln Memorial, saw the David Chester French-designed enthroned Temple of Lincoln. But he also saw etched on the walls Lincoln's second inaugural, Gettysburg Address. Rabbi Sachs thought about this as a young man, and he realized that he'd never seen anything like this. If you go in London to the memorial for David Lloyd George, you'll find that it has 3 words on the memorial: David, Lloyd, and George. Churchill, the memorial for Churchill, has only 1 word on it: Churchill. Now, I don't know if you know much about history, guys, but words were kind of important to Winston Churchill. He kind of made his name using words. I always liked the comedian who said, when I heard Churchill's famous speech, "We shall fight in the beaches, we shall fight in the hills, we shall fight in the mountains," I thought to myself, it sounds like he's describing my family vacation. So why words here and not in England? So Rabbi Sachs said the following: the difference between the American and British monuments is unmistakable. And the reason is that Britain and the United States have a quite different political and moral culture. England is, or was until recently, a tradition-based society. In such societies, it is unnecessary to ask why. Those who belong know. Those who need to ask show thereby that they don't belong. American society is different, this is Rabbi Sachs, because from the Pilgrim Fathers onwards, it was based on the concept of covenant as set out in Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, especially in Exodus and Deuteronomy. And he adds, covenant societies represent conscious new beginnings. They are founded on an idea dedicated to a proposition. And Rabbi Sachs is right. At the heart of the Hebrew Bible, at the heart of the story of biblical Israel, is the concept of covenant, in Hebrew, brit. The story of a people liberated from Egypt for the purpose of covenanting at Sinai, uniting around the text, what Jews call the Torah, a text of laws, doctrines, and ideas. For us as Americans, to turn to our own foundings is to understand how America is a country that is defined by its dedication to ideas, to words, to text. And when I first heard this from Rabbi Sachs, I began to notice this everywhere. I travel a lot. If you go to the train station in Washington, D.C., you'll see that they're selling as souvenirs, different things that have words on them. A tie with the words of the Declaration of Independence, a T-shirt with the Bill of Rights. If you fly out of Heathrow in London, no one's selling a T-shirt with the words of the Magna Carta on it. So you're not going to find that. You'll find images, pictures of the king or the queen. I have a coffee mug from the Kensington Palace gift shop that has on it pictures of Henry VIII and his 6 wives. And when you pour hot coffee into it, the 6 wives disappear. So these are cool souvenirs, but no one's selling words. No one's selling words. Only a society once impacted profoundly by the Hebrew Bible, only a country that at least once thought of itself as having a covenantal culture, would define itself by ideas and therefore would feature something like this. And so what I'd like to do today is to study the uniqueness of some of these American ideas, indeed, the uniqueness of the idea of the American constitutional republic through the eyes of the Jews that lived in America at the moment of the Constitution's ratification. For me, this is personal. As Chris mentioned, I'm the rabbi of Congregation Shereth Israel in New York, the oldest Jewish congregation in America. I've been told by some people here that the Charleston Jewish community claims to be the oldest Jewish community. I'm happy to tell you that's not true. And that they may claim to be true. But as I explained to the provost, they're building on the fact that our community, because we were patriots, fled New York when the British took New York. So I think they call themselves the oldest Jewish continuous congregation in New York. But we are the oldest. And to make sure it sticks, I'm going to mention it like every 10 minutes in this lecture. Our history began with the arrival of 23 Jews fleeing the Inquisition in what was then New Amsterdam in 1654, not that long after the Pilgrim arrival at Plymouth Colony. And they participated, these Jews, in the Revolution and in the birth of the American Republic. And I will attempt to argue that seeing the Constitution through the eyes of the Jews of that era allow us insight into the uniqueness of what the Constitution was seeking to achieve, especially as exemplified by the interaction of those early American Jews with the man who served as the president of the Constitutional Convention and thereafter as the first president of the United States. And we will see 3 different correspondences involving Jews and George Washington, and thereby discover at least one aspect of the uniqueness of the American story. So our story begins with an amazing man, a German Jew by the name of Jonas Phillips, who arrived in Charleston, 1756, and made his way north, became a member of my congregation, FYI, oldest Jewish congregation in America, and married a woman that he met there, a Sephardic Jewish woman. Jonas Phillips and his wife had, I am not making this up, 21 children. 21 children. Jonas Phillips was literally American Jewry's founding father. Okay. In 1776, with the British converging on Manhattan, Phillips and his congregation, deeply devoted to the patriot cause, chose to flee, or as one history of our congregation puts it, flee across the plains of Harlem and Washington Heights. They decamped to Philadelphia, where Phillips served in the Revolution, and ultimately decided to remain in that new city, where he became enormously successful and good friends with prominent Americans, including Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, most famous physician in the United States. When the Constitutional Convention met in 1787, Phillips wrote a letter to the President of the Convention, George Washington. It is this extraordinary letter that we're going to now see. The purpose of this letter was to complain. And this is historic because this is the only time in history that Jews complained. Okay. So the reason why Jonas Phillips was complaining is because, you have to see it from his perspective, these were Jews that had come to Philadelphia from New York because they gave up everything to stand with the revolution. And yet, precisely at the moment of American independence, each former colony, now state, adopted their own state constitution. And the constitution that was adopted by Pennsylvania had a test oath in it. And that test oath required anyone swearing to affirm faith in Christianity. Now, it was not put in mind when it was adopted to exclude Jews. Jews were a very small group. And I think it may have been adopted as an anti-Quaker measure, because Quakers were originally in power in Pennsylvania, and Quakers were reticent about taking oaths. Be that as it may, Jews were excluded from serving in the legislature. And so Phillips wrote to the president of the Constitutional Convention while it was meeting in his city in Philadelphia. And we're going to see his letter. And this is right here on the top. To George Washington from Jonas Phillips. Everybody see it? We're just going to see a little bit of the letter. Sirs, with leave and submission, I address myself to those. First of all, I want to note how great this letter is. One of the greatest things about old letters is we don't have these tyrannical spelling rules like we have to deal with nowadays. Okay? People could spell however they wanted. That's liberty, ladies and gentlemen. Okay? So he says, with leave and submission, I address myself to those in whom there is wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. They are the honorable personages appointed and made overseers of a part of the terrestrial globe of the earth, namely the 13 United States of America in convention assembled. The Lord preserve them. Amen. Not bad for a guy who 20 years earlier got off the boat from Germany, by the way, you have to say. Okay? So then he goes on to describe the test oath, why it violates Jewish faith. And then he says, in the second to last paragraph in what I've provided for you, it is well known among all the citizens of the 13 United States that the Jews have been true and faithful Whigs. Whigs means patriots. And during the late contest with England, they have been foremost in aiding and assisting the states with their lives and fortunes. They have supported the cause, have bravely fought and bled for liberty that they cannot enjoy. So let's pause for a moment, ladies and gentlemen, to ponder the audacity, the chutzpah that Phillips is exhibiting here. Here you have a man who is incredibly successful. He's a friend of some of the founding fathers. He's wealthy, accepted, embraced. The only thing he can't do is serve in the legislature if he wishes to retain his fealty to Judaism. His life, in other words, is a lot better off than, say, my ancestors in Poland and Lithuania at this time. And yet Phillips is audaciously arguing to the most famous and beloved man in America, Washington, that if Jews were not equally able to serve society without violating their conscience and their faith, then they were not truly free, because for Phillips, at the essence of freedom is the ability to be fully part of general society while simultaneously remaining dedicated to what makes one different. And this is a profound point. It was my great uncle, the Talmudist and philosopher, Rabbi Joseph Soloveichik, who argued that to be a Jew in the world, and I would add really to be a person of faith in the world in general, is to embody Abraham's introduction of himself before the purchase of a burial plot for his wife. Abraham says in Genesis, in Hebrew, Ger v'toshav anochi imachem, I am a stranger and a neighbor among you. And my great uncle focused on the dialectic in that phrase. I am a stranger and a neighbor. Meaning, on the one hand, I am a neighbor. I seek to be fully part of the society, to contribute to it, to help it progress and advance. But I do so only on condition that I can also be a stranger, meaning set apart by my faith, by what makes me different. In Rabbi Soloveitchik's words, we believe we are the bearers of a double charismatic load, that of the dignity of man and that of the sanctity of the covenantal community. And in truth, a member of any faith community in a diverse society, Rabbi Soloveichik is pointing out, ought to see oneself as both neighbor and stranger. For a just society allows members of every faith to engage society as an equal without sacrificing one's most sacred beliefs and observances, what sets one's apart. It's just such a society for which Jonas Phillips is fighting here. And this can be seen, ladies and gentlemen, in the most striking and the least noticed aspect of his letter. It's on the top right, the date. This is his letter to the Constitutional Convention. And he writes on top, Philadelphia, 24th Elul 5547. That's the Jewish date. Or September 7th, 1787. Who's he writing that for? There are no Jews in the Constitutional Convention. It's 24th Elul. Or, George Washington, if you're interested in the Gentile date, it's September 7th, 1787. What's he putting that in for? He's writing to Washington, who has never, I guarantee you, heard of the month of Elul in his life. But that's precisely the point. Phillips intends to emphasize that genuine equality means entering society, entering the legislature, entering the public square as neighbor and stranger. And to be a member of a covenantal community is to live simultaneously in social time, that's September 7th, and covenantal time, how you mark your own holidays, how you mark moments in your faith's history. And you seek to do both at the same time. He seeks to be, in other words, as an American, fully part of society without amputating his faith from himself. Now, we have no response from Washington to Jonas Phillips, but we do know that the convention had already enshrined in its draft a bit of text that guaranteed, at least at the federal, national level, the equality that Phillips sought. Article 6, Clause 3 of the Constitution, which states that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. This ban on religious tests only applied at the federal level, but the Jews rightly anticipated that equality of this kind would lead to a disappearance of state laws, such as those in Pennsylvania. And indeed, that occurred in Pennsylvania as early as 1790, soon after the ratification of the Constitution. Phillips's story allows us to understand the uniqueness of the Jewish experience in America. People think that when Jews called America in Yiddish, the Golden Medina, the Golden Land, that what they're describing is economic opportunity. And of course, there are great stories of Jews coming here with nothing, just as there's a story of many people coming here with nothing and achieving great success. So there's an old Jewish joke about a Jew who emigrates from Eastern Europe and comes to the Lower East Side in early 20th century, as so many Jews did. He has no marketable skills at all, so he gets a job as a janitor at what was called the Bialystoker Synagogue. It's a well-known synagogue on the Lower East Side. First day comes, there's a delivery. As the janitor, he has to take it in, and they say, please read and sign here for the delivery. He says, I'm sorry, I just got off the boat from Europe. I don't know how to read or write in English. I can't do that. So the president of the synagogue hears and says, I'm sorry, that's a necessary skill to do this job. You have to take delivery, so we're going to have to fire you. So he's fired, so he has no marketable skills, so he starts selling needles and sewing supplies out of a push cart. Turns out he has a knack for sales, and soon he has 2 push carts, and then a store, and then several stores, and 20 years later, he's the owner of the second largest sewing supplies company in America, about to be bought out by the largest sewing supplies conglomerate in the United States. The lawyers come with the merger papers and say, congratulations, sir, you're about to be a very wealthy man. Please read and sign here. And he says, I'm sorry, I don't know how to read or write English. I can't sign. So they look at him, the lawyers, and say, you don't know how to read or write in English, and you've achieved this much in America? Can you imagine what you'd be in this country if you knew how to read or write English? He says, yeah, I'd be the janitor at the synagogue. Okay, so it is true that America has enormous opportunities. But the truth is that in the 18th and 19th century, in England and post-revolutionary France, there were Jews that achieved wealth far beyond that which the Jews in early America ever found. But what Jews did find in America, which those Jews in Europe did not find, was equality. Not only as Americans, but also as Jews. In England, Jews were not welcomed in Parliament until the 1860s, and only under great controversy, debated throughout the 1850s. And in post-revolutionary France, they were granted equality, but only in a wholly secular public square in which everyone was expected to remove any aspect that set them apart from anyone else. They could be neighbors as long as they ceased to have anything strange about them. In America, in contrast, several years before there was a First Amendment, Jews saw in the Constitution a promise about what America could be, why it offered them the opportunity to be neighbor and stranger, fully American and uniquely reflecting their faith. And this highlights why their experience within this constitutional republic was unlike anywhere else on earth in Jewish diaspora history. This is why, even as for the next many months a debate raged regarding the ratification of the new system of government, beautifully documented in the historian Pauline Meyer's great book, Ratification, to my knowledge, there was not a single Jew in America that was an anti-federalist. Because for them, this is what offered them equality. And the civic celebration of the Constitution vindicated the faith that they put in it. So, in the summer of 1788, in Jonas Phillips's city, a parade was held in Philadelphia celebrating Pennsylvania's ratification of the Constitution. And we have two eyewitness accounts of this parade. One was Benjamin Rush, Jonas Phillips's friend. And Benjamin Rush spoke about a scene at the civic parade that struck him. Quote, "The clergy or the ministers of the different Christian denominations with the rabbi of the Jews walking arm in arm." Benjamin Rush wrote that, quote, "This was a most delightful, quote, a quote, most delightful sight. There could not have been a more happy emblem contrived of that section of the new Constitution, which opens its powers and offices alike, not only to every sect of Christians, but worthy men of every religion." Meanwhile, the other eyewitness account came from someone named Naphtali Phillips. That's Jonas Phillips's son. And amazingly, this eyewitness account was from a recollection that he wrote on October 24th, 1868, 80 years after this parade. So he's 96 years old. Imagine a 96-year-old in the 1860s having known the founding fathers and is speaking about the ratification of the Constitution after the Civil War. And this is what he describes. He says that he describes the parade, and then he adds, he says, "The procession then proceeded from about 3rd Street near Spruce, northward towards Callowhill Street, then wheeled toward Bush Hill, where there was a number of long tables loaded with all kinds of provisions, with a separate table for the Jews who could not partake of the meals from the other tables." So in other words, civic celebration, 1788, there's a separate kosher table for Jews, for Americans that keep kosher. You cannot imagine this, ladies and gentlemen, in Europe in 1788 or in 1888. No wonder this Jew remembers this. And of course, obviously he'd remember it because for us, Jews, most important part of the celebration is the food. So we remember it. And he remembers it. But he remembers what was almost certainly the first kosher food offered at a civic celebration anywhere in the Western world in the history of the Jewish people. So this reflects why Jews were embracing the Constitution, because they found in it the promise of true equality to be both neighbor and stranger in America. And when in the end, the anti-federalists were defeated, the Constitution was ratified, and Washington was elected and inaugurated in 1789, the man to whom Jonas Phillips once wrote, Washington, then himself sought to emphasize the religious diversity of the nation that he led. Washington understood that actually, even amongst the Protestants that made up most of the United States, there was enormous diversity in beliefs. Or, as the historian Michael Meyerson wrote, the fundamental paradox of America's history of religion is that while the individual states began as narrowly focused, religiously homogenous communities, the United States was born a pluralistic nation made up of multiple religious groups, The religious diversity of the country, combined with the powerful direction of the early national leaders, permitted the creation of a distinctly American concept of religious freedom. And therefore, as Meyerson further points out, one of the central drivers in creating this society was Washington. Washington is trying to make people of all faiths feel as if they belong. Thus, when Washington arrived in New York, America's first capital, to take the presidential oath at Federal Hall in New York City, his inaugural procession featured 14 different members of the clergy from New York. 13 of them were Christians, and one was my predecessor, the spiritual leader of Congregation Shearith Israel in New York, because there was a synagogue there, because this is the oldest Jewish congregation in New York City. Gershom Mendes Seixas is my predecessor, and this was, I believe, the first time a Jewish religious figure had played a ceremonial role in the installation of a head of state since the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE. George Washington is sworn in, and then in November he proclaims America's first national day of Thanksgiving. And that Thanksgiving was not about the Pilgrims. It was a day of thanksgiving for the Constitution and for religious liberty. Or, as Washington put it, and you can see it just all the way on the bottom of the page, the last line, what is Thanksgiving for? For the great degree of tranquility, union, and plenty which we have, next side, since enjoyed, for the peaceable and rational manner in which we have been enabled to establish constitutions of government for our safety and happiness, and particularly the national one now lately instituted, for the civil and religious liberty with which we have been blessed. My own congregation participated in the first National Day of Thanksgiving. We follow the same prayer service that we did then. We say the exact same psalms of thanksgiving, just as we did in 1789, and then we go out to our porch overlooking Central Park West, and we watch the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, just as they did in 1789. Thus did America's Jews sometime before the ratification of the Bill of Rights thank God for the gift of the Constitution. And yet, gratitude to God was given by the Jews for the American Republic. But what about gratitude to Washington? Here we come to an embarrassing, though amusing, aspect of early American Jewish history. When Washington was elected and inaugurated, the various minority religious communities in America each sent Washington a letter of congratulations. All the Catholics in America got together, sent Washington a letter. All the Quakers united and sent Washington a letter. All the Baptists got together and sent Washington a letter. The Jews in America could not exactly agree on who would send the letter, so they sent him 3 letters. Now, there's maybe 1,000 Jews in the United States. 3 letters. Now, Washington, of course, is a gentleman, so he writes back to each one, but he's probably wondering, why these crazy people still keep sending me letters? I already wrote back to them. But thank God they did, because each one of these letters is exquisite. Each one teaches us something different, and we will see 2 of the 3. The first Jews that wrote to Washington were the Jews of Savannah, Georgia, which I'm told also has some claims about which congregation in America is the oldest or the oldest Jewish continuous congregation in the United States. So they wrote to Washington, but even they didn't get their act together until the middle of June 1790, over a year after Washington's inauguration. And so they wrote to him originally, and I'll quote to you, this is not in your handout, they wrote, "Our eccentric situation added to a diffidence founded on the most profound respect has thus long prevented our address." In other words, we were so nervous about addressing you, that's why it's delayed. This is what would technically be called a lie. But be that as it may, Washington was very respectful, and Washington responded. But they wrote to him saying that not only do we respect you, we celebrate the Constitution. So they continued, "Your unexampled liberality and extensive philanthropy have dispelled that cloud of bigotry and superstition, which has long as a veil shaded religion, unriveted the fetters of enthusiasm, enfranchised us with all the privileges and immunities of free citizens." That's speaking about that clause in the Constitution. Washington writes back to them. in a little known but amazing letter. And this is here on your handout. He starts by saying, "Gentlemen, I thank you with great sincerity for your congratulations on my appointment to the office." And then he thanks them for their late reply. And then the third paragraph he writes, "I rejoice that a spirit of liberality and philanthropy is much more prevalent than it formerly was among the enlightened nations of the earth, and that your brethren will benefit thereby in proportion, as it shall become still more extensive. Happily, the people of the United States of America have, in many instances, exhibited examples worthy of imitation, the salutary influence of which will doubtless extend much farther." In other words, Washington is recognizing that he has overseen an experimental republic which he hopes will inspire freedom and equality around the world. Now, Washington could have just ended the letter there. The Jews wrote to him saying, "Thank you for the Constitution." Washington responded. He could have ended. Washington knew that whatever he wrote to these Jews would be made public. A, because he's the most famous person in America, so whoever he writes to is going to be made public. And also because the Jews in America aren't going to keep a great letter secret. After all, ladies and gentlemen, the Jewish definition of a secret is something you tell only one person at a time. Okay? So Washington knew that this would be made public, but he went further and ended as follows. Look at this last paragraph in the letter. Let's read it together. Look at it carefully. "May the same wonder-working deity who long since delivering the Hebrews from their Egyptian oppressors planted them in the promised land, whose providential agency has lately been conspicuous in establishing these United States as an independent nation, still continue to water them with the dews of heaven," meaning the Jews, "and to make the inhabitants of every denomination participate in the temporal and spiritual blessings of that people whose God is," and then he uses the biblical name of God that Jews do not pronounce. In these several lines, Washington is not only making Jews feel as if they belong. What he is telling them is, your story inspired us. We don't just welcome you as equals. We are grateful to you because the miracles that happened in the Exodus, we see those same miracles in the providential unfolding of the American Revolution and the American Republic. The God who did miracles for you did miracles for us. You, who are a covenantal people, inspired us to see ourselves as a covenantal people. This is a striking illustration of what the Catholic philosopher Michael Novak noted about the founding, which is that precisely because American Christians, almost largely Protestant, were so divided, actually taking recourse to Hebraic language and imagery provided them with a political language that could actually bring them all together. Or as Novak put it, the language of Judaism came to be the central language of the American metaphysic, the unspoken background to a special American vision of nature, history, and the destiny of the human race. So that was June 1790, George Washington writing to the Jews of Savannah. Then, in August of 1790, George Washington visited Newport, Rhode Island. Why did he do that? Because, ladies and gentlemen, up till this point, really, Rhode Island was not part of the United States because they had refused to ratify the Constitution. They actually didn't take part in the 1789, in the original election. So, the hashtag not my president, that originated with Rhode Island. They were the original hashtag not my president, and it was about George Washington. And so it took them until after the first election. And by the way, the other Americans called Rhode Island Rogue Island. Rogue Island. And the Senate in January of 1790 was actually preparing like an embargo against Rhode Island. And I want to say, just as a matter of counterfactual history, that if there had been a great United States versus Rhode Island war, I think we could have taken Rhode Island, I think. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that. Okay? So now they've ratified the Constitution. So as a reward, because Washington, as we've seen with the Jews, is interested in making all Americans feel as if they belong, Washington goes there. He journeys there. Wasn't that easy in those times. He journeys all the way to Newport, Rhode Island to welcome them. And the lay leader of the Jewish congregation in Rhode Island, Moses Seixas, the brother of my predecessor, Gershom Mendes Seixas, who participated in George Washington's inauguration, he writes a letter to Washington. Let me just cite outside a few brief passages from what Moses Seixas of Rhode Island wrote to Washington. He began, "Permit the children of the stock of Abraham to approach you with the most cordial affection and esteem for your person and merits, and to join with our fellow citizens in welcoming you to Newport. Deprived as we heretofore have been of the invaluable rights of free citizens." Listen carefully to these words. "We now," meaning the Jews, "with a deep sense of gratitude to the Almighty Disposer of all events, behold a government erected by the majesty of the people, a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generously affording to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship." That's a very famous phrase, but it was written originally not by Washington, but by Moses Seixas, this Jewish leader in Newport, writing to the president. Washington, and of course what they're referring to again, is the equality under the Constitution. Washington immediately responded. The very next day, let's look at his letter. This is the last letter on your handout, a letter much more famous than the one sent to Savannah. He wrote, "Gentlemen, while I receive with much satisfaction your address replete with expressions of affection and esteem, I rejoice in the opportunity of assuring you that I shall always retain a grateful remembrance of the cordial welcome I experienced in my visit to Newport from all classes of citizens." Now let's look at the third paragraph. "The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship." Now the next line is all Washington. "It is no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of peoples that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily," he continued, "the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens." So now, the most famous phrase from Washington's letter, which is quoted to this day, describes America as a government which gives to bigotry no sanction, persecution no assistance. But Washington did not compose that. He's just echoing what the Jews of Newport had written to him. You're right, this is a government that gives to bigotry no sanction. But Washington did add a political point of his own. Everyone knew that one of the earliest origins of religious freedom in the Anglo-American West came from John Locke's letter concerning toleration, where Locke argued, he said, look, we can't force people to believe things, so we might as well tolerate them and not punish them for their belief. And Washington's writing saying, that's not our policy. You have just as much a right here to be Americans as we do. We're not tolerating you. You are equal to us. We are embracing equality. And so we have two very different letters from Washington. One ends on a biblical note, comparing America to the birth of biblical Israel in the Exodus, capturing how the ideas behind America allow America to consider itself a covenantal society. The Newport letter actually describes some of the significant ideas around which the American Republic is formed. First and foremost, its concept of equality and liberty, and equality and liberty in this case, as reflected in what Jews saw offered to them in the birth of the American constitutional republic. The letter to Newport speaks of equality, while the letter to Savannah compares biblical Israel to America, reflecting how Washington saw America as a covenantal nation, a nation dedicated to a series of ideas which it was proposing to the world. And then Washington closed his letter to the Jews of Newport in words that are very important to this very day, which speak to Jews in the very moment, I would say, this very moment. And it ends off, final paragraph. It would be inconsistent with the frankness of my character not to avow that I am pleased with your favorable opinion of my administration and fervent wishes for my felicity. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, in our own due time and way, everlastingly happy. And so we gather, ladies and gentlemen, to help inaugurate this incredible program in civic education and civic leadership and public discourse. And we look to one of the great figures in American history, one of the greatest of figures, who himself sought, in his own interaction with a tiny minority community in America, to engage in a form of correspondence that would endure as one of the great embodiments of excellence in civic engagement and public discourse. And those letters taken together in tandem remind us how America celebrates ideas rather than images, that ours is a covenantal country, a country that declares fealty to a text rather than to a sovereign of flesh and blood, a country inspired to see itself as a covenantal people by the example of biblical Israel. Today, it's not quite clear that the imagery of Hebrew scripture that spoke so profoundly to the founders is as well known to everyone in America today. Because the hard truth is we don't live in as biblically literate a society as the age of the founding. But that makes it all the more important, whatever one's faith may be, to rediscover these texts and to see how concepts such as covenant so inspired the founding. And to also discover how Washington, in his promises to a very small community, teach us about the nature of our country and what it means to be equal and free, for all of us to be equal and for all of us to be free. Every year around Memorial Day, my congregation, I don't like to talk about this, but oldest Jewish congregation in America, visits our oldest cemetery, which is now in Chinatown in Manhattan. It was actually created long before the Revolutionary War, and Washington actually set up guns. The Revolutionary Army set up guns there. There's references, I think, by General Gates of setting up guns on the Jews' cemetery. So we go there around Memorial Day to honor and to plant flags at the graves of members of our community that served in the American Revolution. That's what we do. And one of those graves is Jonas Phillips, who died in Philadelphia, but whose body was brought back to his original community, where he was buried in our cemetery. And in general, when I have the ability, when I'm there and I have the ability, I reserve to myself the privilege of planting a flag at Jonas Phillips's grave, reminding me that the Jewish experience of acceptance in America began long before Sandy Koufax, and that to remember it is to pay tribute to Jews like Jonas Phillips, who sought to hold America to the promise of equality on which it was founded, and to leaders like Washington, who sought to explain what this equality meant. And so I close by referencing another baseball player, one who was also a philosopher, Yogi Berra, a man who was not Jewish, but who, it bears mentioning, passed away on Yom Kippur, 50 years to the day of the Yom Kippur that Sandy Koufax refused to play. What's the spiritual significance of that? I have no idea, but still surely very interesting. And Yogi Berra has many famous great philosophical maxims. I thought of one today when I checked into my hotel, because it was Yogi Berra, when he stayed at a hotel, said, the towels there were so thick, I could barely close my suitcase. But my favorite statement by Yogi Berra was when he was told that the mayor of Dublin, Ireland was Jewish. And the great Yogi ruminated and said, the mayor of Dublin, Ireland is Jewish? Only in America. Only in America, indeed. I thank all of you for the opportunity to tell the story of my fellow Jews in this covenantal nation, to describe the beacon of equality that they found in a series of words, in a series of texts, in a covenantal collection of ideas. and to express the hope that as we prepare to mark our 250th anniversary, the exceptional nature of this republic endures. Thank you very much for having me. Now comes the hard-hitting interview. I'm excited.
We've been gentle with you
Yeah,
so far. have we
so
not?
far you've been wonderful.
I wonder, while we're waiting for cards to emerge down here, and we're gathered here today, Solly, the day after our national holiday, Martin
Yeah.
Luther King Jr. Day, and I wonder if you could reflect a little bit about the parallels and also the differences between the
yes.
struggle of African Americans in the United States, who also look back to the covenantal relationship that's manifest in the Hebrew Scriptures, and the relationship of the Jewish people.
So, of course, the equality that Jews discovered in America was not, of course, at the Martin Luther King Day as a reminder to us, of course, that equality was not bestowed on some of the earliest Americans. And at the same time, to ponder King's legacy is to, as you mentioned, Chris, to think about how biblical covenantal images of freedom, as well as, of course, the story of the Exodus, played so profound a role in the story of the expansion of equality in America. This is true, of course, in King's rhetoric, which simultaneously joined religious language, free at last, thank God Almighty we are free at last, with the covenantal promise of the Declaration of Independence, because our original covenant is the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be a covenant. A biblical covenant is people who bind themselves to each other, this is not my definition as others, in support of a proposition in the presence of God. I think that's how Richard Niebuhr translated a covenant. And of course, that's what the Declaration is. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. In support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And so that's story. You see that theme throughout King's achievements. And of course, if you look earlier to the story of the Civil War, you see it as well. Abraham Lincoln, right on his way to his inauguration, gave a remarkable but little-known speech in Trenton, New Jersey. Lincoln was super excited to be there. He was probably the only person in human history to be excited to be in Trenton, New Jersey. Okay, anybody from New Jersey here in the audience? I'm from New York. What we say is, if you want to know why we in New York are depressed, it's because for us the light at the end of the tunnel is New Jersey. So, but Lincoln called America in that speech an almost chosen people. That's his phrase. And he described how, reading as a boy about Washington crossing the Delaware into Trenton, it made him believe that America's promise, what they fought for, he said, was not for independence alone, but for that great promise that was held out to the world for all time to come. So that's what it means to be a covenantal nation. You stand for a series of ideas that you present to the world. And that's why, as the Catholic historian Paul Johnson notes, if you look at Lincoln's second inaugural, which I think to be the greatest speech in the history of the United States, it's less an inaugural speech than a sermon. And what Paul Johnson said is, you can't imagine any of Lincoln's contemporaries, Garibaldi or Louis Napoleon or Palmerston, giving that speech. Lincoln was about to win the Civil War, but he doesn't get up and say, USA, USA. He says, let's talk about, he says, the most counterintuitive but the most biblical thing possible. And Frederick Douglass, watching it, said that watching him speak, I saw in him all the spirit of the Hebrew prophets. He gives a Jeremiah, and he says, we have to think about why this has happened to us. And the sin of slavery has brought this upon us. And then he concludes, though, of course, with biblical hope, with malice toward none, with charity for all. It's the most biblical speech in the history of the United States. But it's actually unimaginable as a great political speech in any other Western country in the same period.
There's an interesting question here that I mean, in a way, asks for a kind of parallel to the story that you're telling. You're telling the story that obviously has deep religious roots, right? Uses religious language,
Right.
the language of covenant. But there is also a part, obviously, of the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident,
Yeah.
which I think points to a natural law foundation.
Wonderful
a
question.
Foundation in reason that's not
Yeah.
required, that we don't require a particular
Yeah.
revelation for. I wonder if you could also maybe say something about the role of reason
Yeah.
in the articulation of the truths that the Declaration is trying to
So it's a
identify.
wonderful question. The way I've described it in the past is that I think at the heart of the American covenant is a double helix. And the double helix is there are teachings of the biblical tradition, and then there's teachings of the Enlightenment, and so forth. And at times, these traditions are in tension with each other, and at times they're in beautiful synthesis with one another. And there's no question. And of course, different emphases were placed by different members of the founding fathers. Jefferson was very much an Enlightenment figure. Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence contained very little religious language. Those phrases I mentioned in support, referring to providence or appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, that was not in Jefferson's first draft. But they were added. And if John Trumbull, in his great painting of the Declaration, went out of his way to try to track down the images of all of those that signed it, as many as he could find, it's because in the end it was not just a product of Jefferson. As somebody pointed out, the Declaration is the only example in the history of the world where a brilliant writer wrote something and then a political committee took it and made it better through their edits. When does that happen? And we should ask the political representatives here. We know what happens. You write something, then it gets staffed out, right? And then 8 different edits comes. There's a very funny, if you look at Peggy Noonan's memoir about being a speechwriter for Reagan, she has a great thing about how once she took the Gettysburg Address and she imagined how the staff of the Reagan White House would have said, no, this language too strong, too offensive, this, that, and it ends up like very tame, you know? So this is the only case that happened where they took the mind of America and put it together. So you see biblical language and you see the language of reason. And the two work together. On the one hand, of course, reason plays such a huge role in the philosophy of the American Republic. On the other hand, many founders believed that the biblical concept of human beings being created in the image of God is the foundation of human equality. Because, of course, the classical tradition, Aristotle, Plato, they don't have human equality as part of their tradition. Aristotle's politics is founded, as many note, on the opposite of human equality. Some people are born to lead, and some people are born very much the opposite. And so John Adams wrote something like, I believe the Hebrews have done more to civilize man than any other nation. Even if I were an atheist to believe that all was ordained by chance, I would believe that chance had ordained the Jews to preserve and propagate the concept of an all-wise, all-knowing creator of the universe, which I believe to be the foundation of all morality and consequently all civilization. And so I'm paraphrasing. I don't know if I got it exactly right. But
Still impressive.
yeah, I mean, I was making it up. But no, he did write something like that. And so they're both part of that tradition. And they are at times in tension with each other, just as the founding fathers were at times in tension with each other. Above all, of course, over a revolution that was wholly secular, which was the French Revolution, which Jefferson liked very much, and at which John Adams was horrified. And so you see the tensions even work out in their own relationships with each other. But part of that tension is part of the fascinating layers and complexity of the story of the American Republic.
That's great. I just want to depart from the cards.
Yeah.
Just to say, I think you mentioned during lunch that Adams is your favorite
He
of
is.
the founders.
Yeah.
For political reasons, personal reasons? For
So both.
Yeah.
John Adams
Person of
had,
remarkable integrity.
you know, huge integrity. I love Abigail Adams. I think it's the great marriage of the American founding. Obviously, George Washington had a very good marriage, but as historians note, this was the only real case where husband and wife were true intellectual partners. And Abigail Adams is one of my favorite people. And, you know, he speaks to me, John Adams. he's kvetchy and, feels like he doesn't get enough credit. That speaks to me. An intellectual feels that he doesn't get enough credit because some people are better at taking the credit. For some reason, that speaks to me as well. Whatever, I can't put my finger on it precisely, but I admire that in somebody. It's almost like it reminds me of somebody, but I can't. Bald, write stuff, feel you don't get enough credit. It speaks to me. Yeah.
We'll share war stories after.
Yeah,
for a
exactly,
drink.
exactly. Yeah.
So this phrase,
Yeah.
this is a great question. It's very striking in your talk about strangers and neighbors.
Yeah.
Right. And has particular resonance right now with questions about immigration and in particular parts of the country. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that strangers and neighbors
Yeah.
dialectic as it still continues to exist
Yeah.
with us now.
So the best book on this actually is the man I quoted before, which is Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. A book he wrote was a book that was largely about America. And like Tocqueville, sometimes as Americans, we could best understand ourselves when we see ourselves through the eyes of outsiders. So he wrote a book about actually what was happening in Europe at the time, in the early 2000s. And what Rabbi Sacks said is he contrasts different models of how a society works. And he said that when Jews first came to England, what they had was, it's like staying in a hotel. It's obviously, if it's a nice hotel, better than the alternative. It's like being a guest in Downton Abbey, right? It's great, but you're not in charge in Downton Abbey. He says, the opposite, and that's what Jews had originally, was far better than, the shtetl in terms of political freedom and opportunity, but they weren't equals. The opposite is a society that celebrates only difference, because then you have no cohesion whatsoever. So there what you have is society, Jews are originally found in England as a country house. A society where you have only difference is hotel. Everybody has their own room. But if you're staying in a hotel, you have no connection to anybody else. That's what makes staying in a hotel great, right? Because for 3 days, you don't have to worry about anybody else. But that's not a society. A country home has no equality. A hotel has equality, but no society. And so a covenantal society, and Rabbi Sacks saw this in America at its best, is what he called integration without assimilation, or the home we build together, in which each person has a unique contribution to make. And so the goal is, of course, to build a society where you're able to maintain respect for difference, but you also have to expect that difference involves people embracing the creed of the country and seeking to make their own contribution to the advancement of that country. So it's an interesting way, because there were Jews that famously spoke of the melting pot. But Rabbi Sacks is actually saying that's not the model, actually. Melting pot means melts away. It's like a crucible that melts away all your differences. And he says that's not actually what we seek. But we do seek a covenantal society. And to be a covenantal society means that you have to love and support and seek to advance the covenant of the United States. And the covenant of the United States is made up of very specific ideas. Above all, that all men are created equal, and all men means all human beings, of course, endowed with certain inalienable rights. And that, and then there are other ideas that are at the heart of the Constitution. And within that, you have and that means, of course, I'm not saying America is only an idea. There are also different aspects of America that speak to all of us. My wife and I, we take our kids on American history trips. We've taken them to Fort Ticonderoga, Independence Hall, Antietam, Fort Sumter, Gettysburg. I took one of my sons on a Segway tour of Gettysburg, and I hit a tree branch and flew off my Segway and skinned my arm, so I can say I've been injured at Gettysburg. The world will little remember what I said there, but it can never forget what I did there. Um, and we teach them to see these grounds as special and as bound to them. So I'm not saying America is only a set of ideas, but of course, America has at its heart a series of ideas. That is true, because it is a covenantal people. And so a covenantal society allows for difference. That's what makes a covenant society covenantal, that you could be different and still be part of a covenant, as long as you bind yourselves to the ideas at the heart of that covenant. And finding our way there is ultimately, I think, where we should go in our debates, which are built around identity and the meaning of America at this particular moment.
And you're making me, I think, see in a new way the founders, I think, generally shared understanding that education is central to good citizenship. Right?
Yes.
I mean, if you're a covenantal people in the way that you
Oh, yes.
described, then it's just impossible to be a good citizen without
Absolutely.
education.
And the most famous speech about this is Lincoln's 1858 July 4th speech, where he spoke about how he said that only half of America by that time descended from those who had fought in the Revolution. And he said, but if we look around us, we will see those from Scandinavia, like your parents, Chris, and Germany and so forth, whose parents did not fight in the Revolution. He says, and they cannot claim to be blood of those who fought. He says, but when they look at that old Declaration of Independence, and they see that those old men, meaning the founders, had written in it, we hold these truths to be self-evident, no man are created equal, and they bind themselves to that, then they feel that they too are blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh, and so they are. This, meaning the Declaration, is the electric cord that binds us to all freedom-loving people, something like that. Lincoln's speech, July 4th, 1858, before he was president. Yeah.
What do you think, so you've talked, and I think there's a way that we can see your talk as framed around a very important and essential right, a human right. I think what you and I would both agree is an unalienable human right, a natural right of the Jew, that has a particular application for the Jewish people. What do you think, one of the things that we talk about in the center as essential to civic literacy is the question of asking, what does it mean to be a citizen and what are the tasks of citizenry?
Yeah.
And I wonder do you think that the Jews in America have had a special task, or that they still have a special task, and if so, what that is?
Well, that's a wonderful question.
I try.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I think about this a lot. First, I think we need to share our story. And not because, of course, it's the only story in America, but it is a special story. It's amazing. I just wrote an article about the letter by Washington to Newport. And I found, do you know who used to quote the Newport letter all the time? Justice Antonin Scalia. But not speaking to Jews. He cited it in a speech that he gave to an Italian-American foundation a month after he became the first Italian-American to be elevated to the Supreme Court. But he was citing this because he was trying to explain how, he doesn't say covenantal society, but that's basically what he's saying, how embracing these concepts are what make us American. And so, in part, by telling our own stories, we can help teach others about what it means to be an American, just as my learning of other stories can help me better understand what it means. We have an obligation to tell these stories. I was on a Catholic YouTube television show, Bishop Barron Presents. You're familiar with that show, I think. And he very wonderfully and very honestly said, because he had heard me, I'm on the Presidential Religious Liberty Commission with the bishop now, and I cited the letter to Newport. And he said to me, and I thought everybody knew it. And he said to me, which I found very striking, he said, and he posted this, which is wonderful when people are honest also about, not knowing about something, right? And which made me respect him even more. And he said, I'm, as we say on internet language, I'm this days old, right? That's not how he put it. And I just learned about this letter to Newport, and I want Rabbi Soloveichik to come on the show and talk about it. So we can continue to learn about these things. So that's the first thing I would say. To tell that story, and part of the story is, of course, how biblical imagery is bound up with the story of America. The second, I think, is that at least the Jewish story and America's story, both of assimilation, but also in other examples of maintaining difference. Tocqueville, when he came to America, was struck by how part of the American story and part of how America saw the duties of citizens is not just to see oneself as individual endowed with rights, and not just to be partaking in the affairs of state, but the in-between, the associations that make up just your communal life, and how we're each able to do that. And certainly the Jews do have a story about that. To speak of my own faith community, Orthodox Jewry in America, very few people thought in the 1940s and the 1950s that there would be a lot of Orthodox Jews in America by the year 2000. They thought there would just be assimilation and disappearing. But they built their own institutions, day schools, communities, synagogues, and were also part of the larger American story. So I think we have to have gratitude and also to work for the rights of others, not just as individuals, because of course every individual has a right to religious freedom, but also to work for an America in which we can build these Tocquevillian associations that are so central to human flourishing, because we are more than just individuals and state, as we all know very well.
Sally, it's been an immense pleasure having you here with us.
Thank you. It's been my
Columbia,
privilege.
South Carolina, at the
And I want to
University of
thank
South
you all for having me.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.